Assalamu alaikum. Today we're going to be discussing, is philosophy forbidden? Is philosophy haram? Is philosophy just a doorway to heresies? It's a very interesting question. It's actually a big bone of contention. I wouldn't say generally amongst Muslims, although it is something which is now starting to become more popular. So what's your thoughts on this? I mean, it's a very strange thing when you first hear someone saying, actually, no, it's totally forbidden. You're not allowed to talk about this particular topic. You're not allowed to study it. It's basically going to lead you to pure deviancy.
I think there's a few things we need to kind of look at here. Number one, I'm not giving a fatwa because this is not my job. All I can do is naql, which is, and it's very important to kind of outline that from the outset. Naql means transmission. Okay, so there's a difference between making something up yourself and coming to ijtihad ruling and stuff, which I'm not, I cannot do that, and doing naql, which is to transmit the material or the information of scholars, either classical or contemporary. So I think there's a few things that we need to look at. First of all, the definition of philosophy, or what we mean by it, and what the classical scholars meant by falsafah, because they're not interchangeable. That's the first kind of thing. And then when we're talking about arguments for God's existence or anything that of these kinds of category of arguments, how have scholars understood that? And especially now, I think for the most part, although there is some discussion in Ash'ari circles on even the use of mantiq. I mean, I know he forbade it actually. I'm not many people know about this. It's not just
by mantiq you mean
logic. But Al-Akhdari obviously made As-Sulam al-Munawwaraq, which is like one of the kind of treatises, poetry for mantiq. So if it's not just a Salafi specific issue, all right, and there has been discussions in the past about these things. However, I think the first logical place to start is to define what philosophy is and to show how impossible it is to avoid it.
Yeah.
In terms of when we define it, it's different from how classical scholars in Islam understood it.
Okay, so let's first go with a point which I think pretty much academically is quite clear, which is there is no agreed upon definition of philosophy.
Yes.
However, if, for example, I'm going with a general definition that I like, which is thinking about thinking, couldn't that definition apply to pretty much our everyday life and even things that we just reason about?
Absolutely. Look, let's get a definition. This is a definition, obviously, like you said, there's nothing, but this is the vernacular kind of dictionary definition. And Cambridge Dictionary says, the use of reason in understanding such things as the nature of the real world and existence, the use of the limits of knowledge, and the principles of moral judgment. Now, clearly, if we're saying reason, no one's going to say you cannot use reason. I don't think anyone from any school of thought can say anything like that, because that would be absolutely absurd. They would have to be making an argument based from reason to make that argument.
Not only this, Allah directly speaks about
أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, do you not reason? I mean, do you not reason, right?
Yeah.
The Quran says that. So if this is a very broad definition of what philosophy is, and from that perspective, it's almost impossible to kind of argue with the fact that has, not only is it should be done, it has to be done. Or could it be done? Is it mubah or not? It has to be done, right? So you have to reason with opponents and interlocutors, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike. There's no doubt about that. Now, in terms of what the classical scholars understood by falsafa, now a lot of the time they meant Ibn Sina and his followers. Okay, so for example, Al-Ghazali, when he mentions Tahafut al-Falsafa, when he mentions falsafa or al-Madrasa al-Falsafiyya or something like this, or the falasifa, the philosophers, he's not talking about necessarily like what we understand now as that broad definition including reason. He's talking about Ibn Avicenna thought.
Yeah.
And I think that the secondary source material on this, both in English and Arabic, is pretty clear. Like if you read anybody from Frank Griffel all the way to the Arabs who have spoken about Al-Ghazali and the long commentary of the tradition that we've had, even Ibn Rushd, Averroes, who spoke about Tahafut, when he mentions falsafa or falasifa, he's talking about Ibn Sina and his followers. And Ibn Sina and his followers had a school of thought which was almost as established, okay, as Mu'tazilism or Ash'arism and so on. And in fact, I would argue that they influenced Mu'tazilism and Ash'arism and so on. Having said that though, this school of thought was seen and is considered anti-normative because it's not even seen as non-Muslim, it's outside the scope of traditional Islam. In so much as, these individuals, they went done mukhalif, or they went against the ijma' on so many issues. They believed in qidam al-alam, they believed in the eternity of the universe, they believed in, they had actually principles.
Direct things that contradict.
Yeah, like for example, Ibn Sina said he didn't believe that Allah knew the juz'iyat, the particular matters. This is a huge kufri statement, right? And so with Al-Ghazali, and one of the 4 reasons that he gave, he mentioned 4 reasons for doing takfir of Ibn Sina. This was one of the reasons that he gave. And that we won't be resurrected with our bodies and so on. So when a lot of these people are talking about the falasifa, they are talking about a school of thought. They're talking about a school of thought which has these kinds of assumptions and presuppositions which directly go against the Quran and Sunnah, and which cannot be considered traditional mainstream Islam at all.
So would you say that this could be seen as the fallacy of equivocation?
Yes.
So, medical doctor or PhD in law, people sometimes, is there a doctorate in the house? I'm having a heart attack, and a PhD doctorate in law comes forward. So when philosophy is being referred to as something of a in terms of the creedal aspects of Islam which were challenged by people using philosophical principles, using that to mean all of philosophy.
Basically, right. So as you've just mentioned, they would use Aristotelian logic to challenge Asma' al Sifat.
Yeah.
So Mu'tazilis would do this. All philosophers would do that. Because I'll give you an example. The philosopher, that, like Ibn Sina and his followers, believed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't know the particulars, but also that he was eternal, and they believed in something called emanation theory. So that it was almost an aloof God, like the runaway dad or whatever it is. It's almost deism.
Deism.
Yeah, almost a deism, right? And so they believe this, like the sun and the rays, that God had, he was forced almost, he was compelled to make the creation and everything that's in it. They preferred this reasoning over the clear verses of the Quran and Sunnah, which is why it was seen as clandestine apostasy by someone like Al-Ghazali, right? He called him a zindiq, he called him a kafir.
But
right?
What's interesting here, and I think this is important for the viewers, is Imam Ghazali, Imam Abu Hanifa, and even all of the later scholars, in fact even giants like Ibn Taymiyyah,
right,
they used philosophical principles to challenge their...
Right, so since you mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah, now this goes to the naql point that I wanted to actually, the transmission point. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah says in Ar-Raddu ala Mantiqiyyin, okay? He says this, he's talking about using philosophical arguments, using arguments from kalam, in fact. And I'll tell you exactly what he says. He says, وَبَعْضُ النَّاسِ يكون الطريق كما كان أدق وأخفى أكثر مقدمات وأطول كان أنفع له. He says that some people, the more that the method, okay, the طريق, the method, كل ما كان أدق وأخفى, is the more it is precise and more ambiguous in a sense, okay, وأكثر مقدمات, and has more premises, so it's more complicated in a sense, وأطول, and longer to deliver in terms of the argument, كان أنفع له, it will become more beneficial for them. He says لأن نفسه اعتادت النظر الطويل, because this individual, these kind of, like, I'm not using this, he didn't use the word analytic, but these kind of analytic individuals, they are used to that level of inquiry, okay? في الأمور الدقيقة, in these kind of very precise matters. فإذا كان الدليل قليل المقدمات, if the dalil is very few in terms of its premises, okay, أو كانت جلية, or it is something so easy that it's almost like self-evident, okay, very clear, jali, like very clear. لم تفرح نفسه به, he would not be happy with that. He will not be content with that. And listen to what he says. ومثل هذا, and this kind of person, okay, قد يستعمل معه الطريق الكلامية المنطقية. This kind of person, you use with them the kalam method, which relies totally on, or not totally, on mantiq, on logic.
If somebody took that statement and didn't say that's from Ibn Taymiyyah, certain people would say that's a deviant.
And we tried this, and I put this up, and I translated it into English, and I put this, Sheikh Ahmed says XYZ, and I translated it into English, and they were saying this, what kind of deviant speech is this, and they were attacking it, and I said, oh,
Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah. So look what he says. كلامية منطقية وغيرها مناسبتها لعادته. He says, and it's closer to what he's known. لا لكون العلم بالمطلوب متوافقا عليه مطلقا. So here it's very, 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 very clear, and he goes on to say, and I'm skipping a paragraph, وأيضا فإن النظر في العلوم الدقيقة يفتق الذهن It says, and actually, if when you do philosophy or these kinds of umur al-daqiqa, with these kind of sophisticated ulum, it strengthens it sharpens the mind. Basically, it sharpens the mind. وَيُدَرِّبُهُ, and it trains the mind. وَيُقَوِّي, and it strengthens it. عَلَى الْعِلْم, on being able to
articulate
knowledge, right? فَيَصِير مثل كثرة الرمي. It's like basically when you're doing a lot of archery and you become, or ركوب الخيل, or horse riding. He says this strengthens them in those tasks, والركوب and so on. وإن لم يكن ذلك وقت قتال, even if you're not going to jihad and so on, it still sharpens you up for it. وهذا مقصد حسن, and this is a noble objective. Look,
I mean, you couldn't be clearer than that.
I don't think there's anyone that can say anything about that. Honestly, and the thing is about Ibn Taymiyyah himself, and when we have a Sheikh Al-Ujairi, Abdullah Al-Ujairi, who's authored many books, and I believe that he's really been able to synthesize. He's one of those, Saudi Arabian scholars who's been able to synthesize between the Aqidah elements and the philosophical elements in such a beautiful way. Him and many different people in Saudi Arabia now, and in the Arab world in particular. So not just Al-Ujairi, but other people like, for example, Sami Amri, Sultan Al-Umairi. They've started to understand, Meher Amir, a lot of them, they've started to synthesize the knowledge and sharpen their minds and actually produce something which, for those people, that target market, we're talking about the end user who's used to these kinds of analytic philosophies. And by the way, most, if not all of the university departments in the West are analytic philosophies departments. So it kind of caters to that audience, and this is the way. I mean, Western philosophy, if you want to call it that for now, is dominated by the analytic school.
It is. And just to add to this point, I think it's very important for the narratives that you're involved in and others are involved in terms of feminism and scientism and all these types of things. You have to tackle it from a philosophy point of view. What are you going to do? So simply attack it within its own paradigm. Attacking it within its own paradigm, you can't really do that. You have to get to the philosophical principles.
Right.
So, this is extremely important to understand. And I think one thing we could do is, I think you've thoroughly covered that it's definitely permissible and it's definitely beneficial. However, if our hands are tied and someone says, right, you can't use these principles, the question really is, what's the alternative?
Okay, exactly. These people that actually make a big deal about using these principles, when they start speaking to Christians, they'll talk about the irrationality of the Trinity.
Yeah.
When you start, what would you say to an atheist? Oh, you believe in God, that's it, you believe in it. No, I don't. Okay, then that's it, everyone can go home.
But when Imam Abu Hanifa, he had the debate with the atheists.
Yeah, this is another thing, the Salaf were doing this. I mean, the thing is, the real problem is when you use those principles and you try and use them to distort the meanings of Asma' or Sifat, or the names and attributes, the names of attributes of God. So the Mu'tazilis went astray because of that, the Falasifi went astray because of that, many different people, they went extremely astray because of that. We're not advocating this.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not saying let's use this now to challenge the attributes or to do ilgha of them or to cancel them or something like that. That's where it becomes problematic. We say logic is only good insofar as that it brings the horse to water.
Yes,
okay?
exactly. Yeah.
And then ipso facto, there are certain things that the dhihn and the aql, and this is Ibn Taymiyyah's argument, cannot have isti'ab or cannot understand it. And for those things, the Quran and Sunnah now, they tell us some things that we would never have known had the revelation not been available to us.
So I think that's a good point to end upon. I definitely want to hear the comments. Read through the comments, and then we can make more videos on this, inshallah. But I think definitely it is sufficient what we've covered now, that it's permissible to actually use philosophy in certain contexts, but also there are conditions. So it's not just that we're saying, okay, everybody just go and do it. I mean, you got to be using it for a beneficial purpose. You got to know your Islamic creed. What are the criteria?
Right. So look, I mean, this is not for everyone, and this is like, if anything, it will be. I'm not saying it's fard kifaya. I'm not making a hukum like that, but it's for some people to do. Not everyone has to immerse in these things, because it can be very destructive, and we've spoken at length about these things before. It makes no sense for me. I mean, if you're approaching philosophy, analytic philosophy, or continental philosophy, or whatever type of philosophy you're approaching, from a blank slate, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to extrapolate wise,
First principles,
first principle and wise sayings, then I think this is a problem, because you have the most wise book, which is the Quran, and so if you're approaching it for that reason, then wallahi, this is an insult to Allah and His Messenger, because Allah he's given you a guidance, and He's given you a Burhan, and He's given you a Quran. You don't need to go anywhere after that. And but by the way, the best arguments, and may I say, the best philosophical arguments are in the Quran. That's beautiful,
Simple and powerful.
amazing.
Simple and powerful.
And this is what Ibn Taymiyyah said when he wrote a book called Mas'alat Huduth al-Alam. He made a book called The Beginning of the Universe. He said the best argument is these clear ones. This is beautiful. It says that it will get most of the awam, that most of the laity. He's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Most people cannot envisage that were you created from from nothing, or did you yourselves create them yourself? That itself is sometimes more powerful than all the arguments that come thereafter. He makes his point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Quran says it has dalil al-tamanu'. Actually, they call it dalil al-tamanu'. When it says مَتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُم إِلَى بَعْضٍ. That if Allah did not take a son and he didn't have any gods with him, if that was the case, they would have outstripped one another, and so on. In chapter 23, verse 91, where and they call this, Ibn Taymiyyah and others, they call this dalil al-tamanu', which is actually a aqli argument. It's a logical and rational argument. So if we're saying we're not allowed to engage in that, then how can you even argue without? It leads to absurdities.
Yeah, it does. So, and not only does it lead to absurdities, I would say you would have a very impoverished view of Islam.
Absolutely.
Because of that. So, Jazakallah khair for giving your perspective. Inshallah, we're going to be doing regular videos in which we're going to be tackling these types of topics. So let us know your comments below. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.